Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Bob the Bookerer, and today I wanted to look at yet another Booker Prize shortlist. Where does he keep on getting these ideas from? Um, but this time I wanted to focus on a year that on the outside sounds like it was destined to be a little bit more catastrophic than it actually was, and that's 1984. I thought not only is this an appropriate year to do because I've recently finished the books from it, but also it's a great year to focus on just because of actually thinking about the world we live in currently and how 1984 seems like the future we were destined to head towards for a while there, and maybe just about avoided temporarily. But 1984 saw the first time a certain author was nominated and her immediate win thereafter, Anita Brookner with Hotel du Lac. Now, this is a novel that I think is incredibly exciting. Interestingly, Anita Brookner herself really has sort of distanced herself from the novel in more recent years. She kind of said that she barely recognized or remembered the novel. She kind of said that she actually didn't rate it that highly amongst her work, which I am a bit surprised by actually personally, because I absolutely adored it. Now, this is also me speaking as someone who's not read any of her other work, so maybe her other work is a lot better. I don't know. But this book, this very, very slim, beautiful little book, is all about a young woman who is writing kind of stories, and she goes on a little trip essentially to kind of have a bit of a break, and in that break she is staying at this hotel in Switzerland, and she meets this bizarre set of characters. Now, these characters involve a sort of rather pernickety old English woman who kind of wants to be in everybody's business. It involves a man who she kind of starts kind of maybe having some kind of feelings towards, and you've got this backstory of her talking about her kind of relationship back home and her whole life back home and what she's going to do. And in her mind, she seems to be in this weird mid stage of being trapped by her past and by her kind of circumstances, but also suddenly feeling this ability to completely reinvent herself here in this hotel. Now, I have a bit of a soft spot for stories like this. Partly myself because I for a few years sort of lived abroad and did a fair bit of traveling while I was doing that. And for me, being in hostels or being in hotels or anywhere like that, I just find them such fascinating places. And I think something Anita Brookner really gets at very well here is something that I feel that's very special about those places too, is how temporary everything is. Staying in a hotel or staying in any kind of other area can sometimes feel like such a pause from reality. You're suspended in this place for a couple of days or longer, and in that time you've got no other things that you really need to do. You've got this one place and that you can stay in, and nobody else around you knows you, so you can kind of almost reinvent yourself, or you can choose to kind of do with your day a bit more as you want. You know, everything's suspended, your washing's perhaps done for you, you know, food is maybe provided, and there's that real kind of on holiday vibe. However, what I think is really interesting for the main character of Hotel du Lac is that this character is both liberated by that experience but also incredibly trapped. You get this feeling that this character has wanted to suspend her life for a little while, to kind of feel a bit better about everything else that's going on around her, but is just trapped, and has to navigate many of the things kind of at home and like that. It's interesting, the book is also kind of referred to a bit as a romance novel, and I see elements of that, but I think it's a lot more detailed than perhaps that name always suggests. Nothing against romance novels, just that I think there's always an assumption, often an assumption with romance novels, that it is just about the romance. And I think for me, Hotel du Lac feels like it has so much going on, that it's kind of part romance, part sort of psychological character study, part kind of gripping tale of sort of various parts of society and all those kinds of things. So I really adored this little novel. It also seems like, you know, such a surprise little winner in a year with, again, some big literary heavyweights. You know, you've got Julian Barnes in this list. You have got David Lodge, who is, you know, creating quite a lot of comic novels at the time. You've got J.G. Ballard. You know, these are quite big names, and it's quite impressive to me that all of these books kind of were in the same list, but were kind of beaten by a novel that you wouldn't necessarily expect at first to kind of win. But I have a real soft spot in my heart for this novel. I think it's so gripping. It really exposes and investigates the kind of human experience, and there are such brilliant bizarre characters. There's a the kind of sort of pernickety old woman is followed around by a young girl or younger woman who seems so kind of beholden to her, and it's this very strange relationship where this young woman almost seems to have no real life outside of this older woman. But I just think it's so fascinating. Next up, you have perhaps one of the biggest names on this list, and that is J.G. Ballard with Empire of the Sun. Now, this is a novel that goes into a lot of depth around the moments kind of directly after or directly towards the end of World War II. And it's a really fascinating period for sort of several reasons, especially because this novel is set around China, and in a time where Sino-Japanese relationships were particularly difficult, where, you know, China and Japan are kind of so close to each other but so involved in various parts of the war. And you've got this young boy there who is kind of really caught in the midst of this. And this is really kind of relevant to J.G. Ballard's own life. He also was sort of brought up in a kind of towards the end of the war, the Second World War, and kind of lived through some of these parts where, you know, there's a sudden move of, you know, countries really rising up and then kind of crashing down again in terms of their world status and their power and their economic might. And, you know, you've got the big growth of China, particularly big cities like Shanghai, which features a lot in this book. And then you've also got a lot of things kind of going entirely wrong for so many characters and so many people. And it's this really quite heartbreaking journey at times of this young boy kind of trying to navigate all of this. You know, for him, he doesn't quite understand how he has gone from living in quite a well-to-do English family and having kind of all of the comforts and kind of everything he needs, and then now suddenly being in a position where he is sort of living really hand to mouth, really scrabbling around, really relying on, you know, the kindness of strangers to look after him, all the while he's trying to eke out an existence. This young boy at the heart of the story is then made to be on this incredibly long and treacherous march where many people died. It's, you know, a real sort of historical thing that happened. You know, so many prisoners of war were made to do these ridiculously long and arduous marches with the idea that many people would die on the way. That was kind of the idea. It was a way of essentially killing people without directly putting a gun to their head. And it's horrendous. You know, these are really barbaric things. But I think what this novel does incredibly well is unpick how some of those really difficult and horrible moments were kind of happening on many different sides. You know, that it wasn't just one barbaric person, it wasn't just, you know, one country that you could point the finger at. This was a time of complete chaos and distrust and destruction, and so nothing like this could really be you know, could really be understood, and particularly, you know, in this book by a young boy. This book reminds me a lot of When We Were Orphans by Kazuo Ishiguro, maybe also because I read them at sort of similar times, but there's a large overlap with some of the themes. I think both are brilliant books. This book, actually, interestingly, it also won the James Tate Memorial Prize alongside Angela Carter, who is one of my absolute favorite authors of all time. And so the more I think about it, and every time I now think about this shortlist, and not like I think about it on a regular basis, but, you know, every time I'm sort of see that list and see J.G. Ballard's name, I always have a little thing in the back of my mind that, where is Angela Carter on this list or on any Booker list ever? Angela Carter is an absolutely brilliant writer. If you don't know of her, it's well worth looking up. Very kind of beautiful, florid, poetic prose, all about, you know, kind of sort of fairy tales and sexual characters and vaudeville kind of characters. I love her. And so for me, it does sort of seem a bit strange that Angela Carter is not on this list. However, all of that said, J.G. Ballard, with this novel, I just think it's a really well done novel. For me, you know, I sometimes really struggle with historical books, particularly ones about war, and that's not to kind of take anything away from them. I think I've just been made to read a lot of them, not only in the Booker shortlists, but also at school. You know, there were a lot of war novels and poems and everything else that we were sort of made to read. And I think as a result, I have a little thing in the back of my mind of resistance against kind of reading anymore. However, I think this one is done incredibly well. And I think it brings in the themes of war really powerfully, particularly this idea of empire, and empires collapsing, and the kind of dawn of a new age, and all of those kinds of moments, all told through a young boy's eyes. And I think it also does that thing that I really appreciate when, you know, when people are writing through the eyes of a younger person, is it doesn't feel like it's written in that very kind of basic childlike language, which can sometimes be really off-putting for me. This feels like, you know, it's done very, very cleverly. I think not only because there's also a sense of somebody looking back over their life, and this must have been quite bizarre, I would imagine, as well, for J.G. Ballard to write, you know, to really have to fictionalize his own experiences to some degree. And find a way of coping with them and explaining them. Apparently it took him a very, very long time to write books about his experience from when he was a child. You know, his sort of earlier books don't really delve into it that much, and sort of Empire of the Sun is one of those novels where he really starts bringing it in. And in many people's eyes, it's a bit of a bizarre thing that this novel didn't win. I think this was actually seen as one of the favorites very early on, not only because of Ballard's sort of stature as a writer, but also this book was everywhere apparently in 1984. I don't know, I wasn't there, I wasn't alive, but at that time, yeah, this was a book that, you know, sold very, very well, was very impactful. And so for many people, this is, you know, such an iconic book that perhaps it's a bit bizarre that it didn't win. But I think, you know, also a shortlist wouldn't be the same without it. So yeah, I really greatly enjoyed this book. Next up, as I mentioned earlier, we have Julian Barnes with Flaubert's Parrot. Now, again, I spoke about this a bit in my video on Julian Barnes, but this is such a bizarre and wonderful little book. It's short, it's probably about 150 to 200 pages, and it is essentially written as this kind of mix between sort of regular novel and literary criticism, which is really clever and really, for me, works incredibly well, because the main character is essentially doing literary criticism. He is trying to understand a little bit more about Flaubert's life and really trying to track down the parrot that Flaubert mentions in various books, or that, you know, he was believed to have owned. And so this character is kind of going on this slightly bizarre quest. It feels almost a bit like Moby Dick, in that kind of this really unending quest to do something for his own fulfillment, even though he knows that not only does nobody else really care, but also that he has such a desire to do it that without it he will be completely crushed. And this is, you know, it's almost like as soon as he does find it out, his life loses all purpose, like I will probably do once I've actually finally looked at all of the Booker shortlists. What will I do with my life then? Who knows? But this book, I think, is really well handled. It may come to be no surprise to any of you that I absolutely adore Julian Barnes, given that I've made a video about him saying that same thing, and that my 2005 and my 1998 Booker Prize videos also talk about how much I love him. But what I think is so brilliant about this book is that kind of trademark Julian Barnes, little profile of my coffee mug here, that trademark Julian Barnes wit and sort of poetic style, which feels so appropriate when you're writing about a writer, but also that real ability to balance form and content. So the idea that we're writing about an author and we're writing sort of in a literary criticism kind of way to show that actually this is what literary, you know, to talk about literary criticism. Apparently that didn't really help its chances in actually winning. I think the judges were a little bit confused at whether they could really count it fully as a novel, because it does have such of a literary criticism kind of angle. But for me, I think that's what makes this novel so successful, actually, is that it can't really be pinned down all that easily. And indeed, one of the things that's probably the most exciting about it for me is that there's an A to Z bit at one point, which is kind of bizarre, but it basically goes through a sort of an A to Z of Flaubert's life. And I want to say it's under the S for syphilis. There is a whole sort of section about sexually transmitted diseases of Flaubert's time, and how, you know, it was believed that various people in his circle went mad from syphilis related kind of illnesses or anything like that. So it's a bizarre book and has so many little bizarre moments, but for me it's just so successful and so brilliant. And as you can see, my cat has just decided that, no, there she goes, has decided that now's the moment to interrupt again. Next up, we have Anita Desai with In Custody. So Anita Desai, again, is actually no real stranger to the Booker Prize. She gained 3 nominations over her writing career. And then her daughter, Kiran Desai, went on to win the Booker Prize in 2006. But this book, In Custody, is such an interesting one for me. So it's all about these 2 men who are kind of friends and have this kind of business partnership that's kind of a bit strange and a bit really undefined, which is kind of the problem for the characters in the book. Essentially, one of them has a sort of writing press sort of magazine and wants to boost circulation, and kind of thinks at one point that a really good idea would be to interview this sort of famous Urdu poet called Noor, and he is so kind of adamant that this thing should happen, and he kind of enlists the help of his friend, who is tasked with basically doing the thing, you know, going and interviewing and doing everything that he needs to make this happen. But this poet is famously reclusive, or has at least not really published any poems or done any writing publicly, at least for a long time. So there's this kind of slightly madcap adventure at one point of these characters trying to track him down. Once this happens, this character who's gone to investigate and kind of work with him is himself a Hindi teacher. And this kind of obviously then starts bringing up this really interesting dynamic around sort of national language and the debate around that. Now, I'm no expert on this, but this is a particularly contentious thing around kind of India and Pakistan, and this idea that, you know, whereas Hindi is one of the sort of bigger languages in India, Urdu is the kind of main language of Pakistan, and there are people in both countries who speak the other. Now, this Urdu poet is really worried about the fate of Urdu. He's worried that it's dying out, that you know, the Indian state is forcing Hindi on people to make it a Hindi speaking only country, and he is worried about what that means for his own long history of his writing and also the future. Now, obviously then sending someone who, although he absolutely adores Urdu, is a Hindi teacher, kind of complicates matters, and it starts getting more and more bizarre and a lot funnier because of this sort of breakdown. So basically these characters are caught in this bizarre world of kind of treachery and trickery around money and sort of shady business dealings. So actually, whereas one character is going to really go and explore and try, you know, get this interview with this author, when he gets there, he suddenly finds that this poet, this famous writer, is kind of, he's living a kind of a bit of a lap of luxury. He has people round all the time who listen to him recite poems or tell him how amazing he is and all of these kinds of things. He's surrounded by women. And he suddenly realizes that this, you know, sort of sanitized view he had of this holy kind of character of this writer is sort of broken down, and is actually, this writer is actually a bit horrible. And he finds that really difficult at first because he's idolized him for so long. But he also starts realizing that his friend, or so-called friend, has essentially sent him on this mission and kind of promised far more. So actually told this poet that he is going to be there for him as a transcriber, or that he's going to do all this other work for him, whereas actually he thought he was just going to get an interview. And it keeps on going down these weird lanes of madcap kind of things. So for example, he borrows, well, he uses money from his university where he works to buy a tape recorder to record this interview with this famous man. However, in doing so, his university is then kind of wondering about the expenses of all of this and thinking, well, if you're not doing anything that's directly benefiting the university, you've embezzled us, you've stolen money from us, how can you? So he's then in trouble with the university. His wife back home is wondering why on earth he hasn't been back to the family in a while, because he had to take this long train journey to get to where this this writer is. He is just, you know, kind of caught in all of these bizarre places, and I just think this is a deeply warm and rich and funny novel. You know, not my favorite on the list necessarily. I mean, I still think it's an absolutely beautiful and brilliant book. I maybe didn't fully connect to it, but I think it's, you know, it's so short, it's so funny, and something that I really appreciate in the books I've read of Anita Desai is this real ability to find kind of flawed, funny characters who are just very, very human and just make mistakes and get caught in madcap schemes all the time. And I just think it's brilliant. So yeah, I think it's a little fun book, and I totally see why it made this list. Continuing what is maybe a bit of a theme actually in this book of shortlist is the idea of writing about writers, and our next one is Penelope Lively with According to Mark. Now this is a really interesting novel, and I adore Penelope Lively's style. I've only read 2 of her novels, this one here, According to Mark, and Moon Tiger, which won the Booker Prize 3 years after this, which is exceptional, by the way, just mind-blowingly good. And for me, what is so fun and special about this is not only her writing style, which always feels very alive and present and like she's one step ahead of you, but also just this is quite a fun little story of essentially obsession. So there's this sort of main character who we follow is obsessed with this kind of artist and author before, and wants to completely immerse himself in all of his letters, everything about him. And, you know, he sees himself as basically an expert on this man. And I always find biographers as a kind of concept quite exciting and quite fascinating. Just the idea that someone would spend so long researching one person or one group of people to the extent where they almost know them inside out. They could write, you know, whole stories from in their minds, and, you know, knowing what they did next, knowing all of their secrets, knowing their wishes, their deepest fears, all of those kinds of things. And I think it's quite fascinating to kind of try and get a little bit inside the mind of a biographer. But this character gets more and more complicated because he starts to, his obsession seems to grow to the extent where he suddenly realizes that there's this whole set of letters and documents that he has never heard of before, that nobody knows about. And he suddenly has this quite bizarre ethical dilemma where he's really got to consider, do I write about these things and paint my hero, this person I love, this person I know so much about, do I paint him as a bit of a villain by exposing some of these things because he's treated women badly, or he had a series of failed relationships that do not make him look good, or anything like that? And you suddenly start to get this kind of broader picture where you realize he has to contend with kind of this hero worship he has, and understand, you know, what will he do with this information now? Is he going to write about him truthfully, which should be the job of the biographer, or is he going to keep some of this sort of dignity of this life, and maybe protect others in doing so? What also further complicates this is, by doing this, he starts to basically have a bit of an affair with this woman who is the granddaughter, I believe, of his of this man that he's writing about. And so for him, this is very exciting, because he is kind of finding out a bit more, but she doesn't necessarily know that much about him, but she just has access to all of these documents. So his personal and professional life really starts crossing over in quite problematic and quite bizarre ways. And he's not entirely sure where he sits with all of this, but for the most part, he kind of presses ahead, and you do get the feeling that he's a bit of a, you know, a bit of an idiot. Just he's not that nice. His sort of wife is kind of constantly confused about what's going on at first, but you suddenly realize she's incredibly perceptive and wise. She knows what's happening, and she jumps the gun. Like, she basically speaks to this woman and says, like, look, I know that you and my husband have had a thing. Maybe it should stop. And actually, ultimately, she comes across as just one of the best characters in this book, I think. This wise, knowing, wife who is just so done with her husband, but kind of, you know, is there to kind of pick up his pieces and make sure he's all right, because she's been cleaning up after him for her life. And so I just think this is a really rich and funny and warm novel, but at the same time poses really interesting questions about one's life. Like, what does it mean to know everything about someone? And, you know, are there secrets that should remain hidden after death? You know, it makes us maybe think about some of the people in our families or in our lives. Would we want some of their secrets exposed? But actually, as soon as it's sort of a famous author or someone like that, the public really wants to have this knowledge. But actually, do we have a right to it? Are we meant to have this information? And I think that for me, that's a really interesting way of looking at some of these issues. Again, just a wonderful book. It's just, I love her. Penelope Lively is amazing, and I need to read more of her back catalogue, which by now is almost a catchphrase of mine. I realize I say that about literally everyone, but I mean, well deserved in Penelope Lively's case. She's just such an astute and sharp writer, and the 2 books I've read of hers so far, I've just thoroughly enjoyed. And finally, we come to David Lodge with Small World. Now, this is part of a trilogy, and the next book in the trilogy, Nice Work, which I'm reading at the moment, went on to also be shortlisted. But essentially, this is a campus-based trilogy, all about these kind of eccentric university characters, all very much concerned with this world of academia, which from the outside is quite impenetrable and bizarre and makes very little sense. And all of the characters are deeply flawed and clinging on to a system that doesn't really make any sense. So in the first book of the trilogy, Changing Places, the kind of main changing that is sort of spoken about is these 2 male professors who, you know, one from the US, one from the UK, and they swap places, they change places, and in that kind of changeover, they experience the other side, what the other academic world looks like. And in the introduction to that book, David Lodge writes a little bit about how this was a really interesting time, because although the US and the UK have always had differences since the US was, you know, established, the kind of differences were particularly stark around that time. And actually in the last sort of 30 and a bit years since this novel was, almost 40, gosh, since this novel came out, the changes have become a bit subtler, because, you know, we've had so much more engagement with each other's worlds through television, through the internet, through whatever else. But especially at that time, the US UK differences were so stark. And so in Changing Places, these 2 men start sleeping with the other one's wives while they're over there, and their own marriages are falling apart. And so essentially, Small World starts with a kind of an understanding from the previous book that the 4 of them have decided to sort of live together in a slightly bizarre arrangement to some degree, where they haven't exactly swapped wives, sort of haven't, but there's also an understanding that, you know, the triangles, or kind of whatever shape it would be, probably some bizarre love square or diamond, would be incredibly complicated and messy. So this novel, in many ways, it's kind of, again, hard to talk about what really happens in it, but the characters are all kind of, there's a lot of this kind of academic squabbling of characters fighting over job roles, over kind of getting their papers published, getting this kind of high status kind of bestowed upon them, and this kind of really messy, bizarre world. Now, it's a comedy novel, and comedy novels are often hit and miss, although have a bit of a good track record with the Booker Prize, actually, in terms of getting shortlisted. And there have been a fair few of them that have made it there. But for me, I don't know, for me, this doesn't necessarily always work. I enjoyed it overall. I just think it feels incredibly dated very quickly, and Nice Work, which I'm reading at the moment, feels even more dated, despite the fact that it was more recently written. I don't know what it is. I think maybe it's because so much of it relies on that very old school British humour of kind of everyone sleeping with everyone. It's a bit, basically, it's kind of like a Carry On film, but set in a university, kind of Carry On don't try to think of a really good pun off this now. This is not going to come to me off in the heat of the moment, is it? But it's a carry-on film in a university, and that can be really successful in ways. There are some parts that I found really genuinely very funny. So with characters who are so flawed and so myopic in their view of the world because they've existed only really in a university setting, that they don't understand anything happening in the world outside them. And those characters are kind of falling amongst themselves, trying to get published or trying to get this role of the UNESCO chair. So there's a kind of professorship position created for UNESCO, which is a bit of a satire in itself on the idea of tenure and sort of official kind of professorial roles, right? Because very, very sunny all of a sudden, because these characters suddenly are so obsessed with getting this job role where essentially you're paid $100,000 a year to think, that being the only stipulation, that you don't actually really have to do anything. Maybe you could publish a piece of work if you wanted to. You don't have to. The only real goal is that you think for a year, and it's kind of a bit of a, you know, it pokes fun at this idea of what does it mean to be an academic. You know, it's so divorced perhaps from the real world. Something I do appreciate in David Lodge's trilogy here with these novels is he is very good at kind of satirizing the type of novel he's writing whilst he's doing it. So for example, in Changing Places, there's this whole thing about novels all set around ideas of coincidences, and he sort of says this, but the novel actually also starts with two planes completely just going past each other, with the two main characters going past each other. So all of these kind of stupid coincidences and bizarre things and their worlds mirroring. And he pokes fun at that very idea. A couple of times he says, oh, you know, the novels of ideas around coincidence are so passe while he's writing one. And same for Small World, which talks a little bit about how campus novels are so over. So there are a lot of really funny moments, but for me, it just, I don't know, I kind of feel like if I read it at the time, I would have thought, okay, this is good, but this is definitely a turning point in time where this sort of novel suddenly kind of grew, it went out of fashion. The kind of sense of humor of it started to feel a bit done, perhaps. And so I'm not sure if I necessarily loved it. I did find myself not necessarily skipping, but at least reading fairly nonchalantly, thinking about my dinner or whatever, maybe in parts of this, because it's not always that exciting. And I also think it's sometimes a bit of a tall order with funny books, when it's kind of joke after joke after joke, because actually that can be quite exhausting as a reader, I think, in the same way that tragic incident after tragic incident after tragic incident, that is hard as a reader as well. I think you need a bit of a balance of kind of dark and light in some of these books, and that's something I struggled with a bit with this book, is it's kind of joke, 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 in the same way that a lot of people had quite a few opinions around The Finkler Question by Howard Jacobson. And I kind of felt the same way for parts of it. I think it's a bit more successful than people give it credit for, but that novel is kind of joke, joke, joke. And so every paragraph, it feels like you're kind of being set up for a joke and you're always kind of waiting for it. Almost in the way that, you know, if you watch loads of funny videos or comedy sketches or funny films or whatever in a row, if you then go and watch something that's not a comedy, you don't really know what to do. You're almost so ready to kind of receive a joke and receive a punchline constantly that you're kind of on edge. And that's a bit how these novels make me feel. Oh, hello, how are we doing? Okay, she's good. She doesn't like the novel, apparently. She's good. She's done. But for me, this novel doesn't always necessarily sort of sit successfully where it is, but I think this is also kind of the joy of going back and reading books over. Oh, here we go. She's back here again with me. Do you want to come and say hi? Yeah. It's not books. Prizes like this can be really interesting to look back at old books and see where actually some of these things were very, very good for their time, but maybe haven't remained so. They haven't kind of stayed the kind of course. You know, a novel like Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro, Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. For me, these are books that, although they were dealing with a very current problem in some ways will always feel particularly relevant, and kind of we'll always perhaps go back to them because they deal with something so human and something so of the world, right? I think something like this kind of these kind of campus novels can feel like, yes, you know, they bring enjoyment, but they very much feel like a product of their time. And for me, it's kind of bizarre to, it's my cat hair flying everywhere. For me, sometimes it's a bit bizarre to think of a book like this really being read in a big way in many years' time. I mean, the fact I'd not heard of it at all. I have heard that some of David Lodge's other work is a lot more successful or a lot funnier in a kind of other sense, I guess. Hello, she's loving this sun, isn't she? But you know, that in some ways books like this maybe they are of a specific time, and not every book has to be universal and timeless. You know, a book can just be fun and silly and whatever, and I think that's kind of what's happening here. But I think it does also make some really good points and bring in some interesting ideas around university life. Anyway, I have babbled on enough about some of these books, and now my cat's biting me. And let's kind of wrap it all up in terms of thinking about this whole Booker shortlist. So we have these 6 books, a lot of which are about writing or writing about academia in quite a weird way. You don't often see that many of these books kind of with that kind of theme all together on a shortlist. I don't know if something was just happening in 1984 that made everyone think about that. But for me, I think it's a really fun list in many ways. I'm really glad that this list brought into my life books like the J.G. Ballard book, Empire of the Sun, and the Anita Brookner novel. This really transformed her career. She was, you know, fairly early in her writing career, I believe, and hadn't, you know, wasn't a big, well-known name. Hello. So she's she's making the cutest faces just off camera, which I really wish you could see because she's adorable. Hang on, let's bring her back. How are we doing? How are we doing? Let's. Okay, here we go. Okay, I won't pick her up. But I think what's you know, it really launched her career, and that's something that's so special about this prize for her. Even though she's sort of disavowed or disowned the book in some way since, I still think, you know, Hotel du Lac is such a successful book. It's so short and so tense and tight, and I think that's what's so great about it, is it's just somehow in such a short amount of space she really constructs this character, does a really deep psychological study into various characters, into the idea of leaving behind your home, you know, starting again, you know, that sort of suspended life of being in a hotel or anything like that. And I think that's what makes it just so powerful and brilliant for me. It's so gripping. For me, if Hotel du Lac didn't win, I would really have loved to have seen Empire of the Sun win, because I think that's a brilliant little book. Or probably my personal favorite would have been Flaubert's Parrot by Julian Barnes. I realize that's a much tougher oh, she's being so cute. Hello. It's a much tougher kind of book for kind of general consumption, if that makes sense, in the sense of, you know, people kind of being kind of told that the best book of the year that everyone must go out and read is a book all about a man writing literary criticism about Flaubert and trying to like track down a parrot. And parts of the book are basically written like literary criticism. That's a hard sell. And I realize that that's a bit niche and not everyone's going to absolutely love that. But I think, you know, it's a great little shortlist and magically different to what you would kind of expect for a shortlist in 1984, given, you know, George Orwell's book. It's fun to me to think of George Orwell kind of creating this idea of, you know, we're going to have this really totalitarian state, and instead you've got 6 books that are largely about writers, just talking about writing. So it's all good fun, and I just think it's a great list. Anyway, as always, I've been Bob the Booker, babbling on about a Booker Prize shortlist, because that's what I do now, apparently. That's my life. And I hope you enjoyed it. Please do let me know if you've read any other books by these authors, or if you have any particularly strong opinions about the books here. And I hope all is going really well. Enjoy your reading. Take care. Bye-bye.